working to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles. Welcome to ASEAN in Focus. And today we're joined by our EBC Thailand Bureau, Esther Odanga. Hello, Esther.
Hello, I'm Esther Odanga from EBC Thailand Bureau, giving you the news in the dynamic ASEAN region.
On today's headlines. A total of 40 stranded Filipinos were brought home from North Sulawesi, Indonesia.
What we're doing here,
Philippine ambassador to China, at least 3 to 4 vaccines on phase 3, one about to complete trial.
Global financial titan Goldman Sachs agreed to pay $2.9 billion in penalties to settle criminal charges in the 1MDB Malaysian bribery scandal, the largest U.S. fine ever in a corruption case.
Thailand's premier revoked an emergency decree that had been intended to quell pro-democracy rallies.
A total of 40 stranded Filipinos were brought home from North Sulawesi, Indonesia on the 17th of October, following a successful repatriation efforts made by the Philippine Consulate General in Manado in coordination with the Philippine Embassy in Jakarta and the Department of Foreign Affairs Consular Office in General Santos City. The second batch of repatriates from Manado were fetched by the Philippine Coast Guard vessel BRP Tubataha on the 15th of October after being granted a diplomatic clearance from the government of the Republic of Indonesia. The vessel docked at the port of General Santos in the morning of the 17th of October. The local governments of General Santos City, Davao City, Mati City, municipalities of Glan and Malungon in Sarangani Province, municipality of Governor Generoso in Davao Oriental, and the municipalities of Sarangani and Santa Maria in Davao Occidental were present to receive their respective constituents. In compliance with health protocols implemented by the Interagency Task Force on Emerging Infectious Diseases in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, RT-PCR tests were administered to all repatriates prior to their departure, and they were subjected to another round of mandatory RT-PCR testing and 14-day quarantine in designated facilities before being cleared to return to their families. The repatriation was made possible with the full support and cooperation of the DFA, Office of the Undersecretary of Migrant Workers Affairs, the PCG, CGD, Southern Mindanao, the Philippine Ports Authority, Port Management Office of General Santos, the Bureau of Quarantine, the Bureau of Immigration, and the local government unit of General Santos.
Vietnam and Japan have agreed to implement an expedited arrival procedure for short-term entrants from November 1, according to a press release of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Accordingly, both countries will lift mandatory quarantine requirement for people from either country who are going on trips shorter than 14 days for the purposes of investment, trade, diplomacy, official businesses, or highly skilled workers. Prior to arrival, an entrant shall have to obtain proof of negative test for COVID-19 and undergo body temperature screening. The entrant will be tested for the virus and placed under frequent medical surveillance, and they could only engage in activities according to his or her registered working plan. Authorities of Vietnam and Japan will provide detailed instructions on how to implement this procedure.
The Philippine ambassador to China, Jose Santiago Chito Santa Romana, gave an update on the ongoing vaccine clinical trials there. He mentioned that 3 to 4 vaccines are already in phase 3, and one is about to complete the trials with good results. He also said that the Philippines remains a top priority when it comes to the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. Let's listen in.
What we're doing here, what the Philippine Embassy in Beijing is doing, is really facilitating the contacts between DOST and DOH and the Chinese side, no, regarding the vaccine. As you know, the Chinese right now are in the advanced stage, no? Nasa phase 3. They have at least 3 to 4 vaccines that are now being tried in China. No, they reported yesterday that, or the other day, that one vaccine is about to complete the phase 3 trial, and so far the results have been fairly good. There's been no report of an adverse reaction. There is another vaccine that is under phase 3 trial and is also undergoing international experiment in Brazil and the UAE. And in the UAE, or in the Middle East, as far as I know, there are some Filipinos, no, over 1,000 Filipinos that have been involved in the phase 3 trial. This is important because the vaccines being developed in China have been tried among Chinese patients or among Chinese citizens. But it is important to try it also with other citizens of other countries. No? That is why the Chinese have a joint program with Indonesia. Some Indonesian patients are being treated, are undergoing this phase 3 experiment. In Brazil, there's quite a number of Brazilians undergoing it. So they're trying it with different nationalities. In China, they're already using the vaccine on an emergency basis for their frontliners. So lahat ng frontliners, particularly in the hospitals dealing with COVID, are already undergoing or have already been given the vaccine. The same with airport personnel, those dealing with customs and those dealing with coastal ports, no? Because in China, basically under control na yung local community transmission. Their problem really is how to deal with what they call imported cases. Those coming in from abroad, Chinese or foreigners bringing in the virus, and that's why very strict yung testing and quarantine for international arrivals. But back to the vaccine. So they hope to go into mass production soon. And so the question is yung distribution. As you know, the Philippines is one of the priority countries. Now, this was an agreement during the phone conversation between President Duterte and President Xi, and this was reiterated when Secretary Locsin was here and had an exchange or a conversation with State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. However, distribution will be a challenge, even if we're in the priority list. One, because the Chinese companies we have been in contact with have said that we need, or the recipient countries should make sure that they have the capability for receiving the vaccine. Kailangan kasi yung tinatawag na cold chain storage. No? These vaccines have to be stored in the conditions, freezing conditions. Otherwise, if exposed to a tropical weather or to normal weather conditions, the vaccine could lose its effectiveness. No? So, of course, these are matters for the experts to deal with. But basically, to point out that from our discussions with the Chinese pharmaceutical companies, they pointed out that the next challenge really is the distribution and the deployment of the vaccine. Hopefully, mass production and distribution will happen in the near future, no? As early as November or December in terms of production, and it will depend on our capability to receive the vaccines in terms of our facilities, no, in terms of distribution. So the prospects are bright in terms of a breakthrough in vaccine. At least, as far as I know, in China, there's a possibility for 1 or 2 vaccines that will be approved here soon. And of course, they have to undergo their own requirements in the Philippines, no? Because the Philippines, you have to clear FDA requirements, DOST, DOH. So this is something I think that these agencies are already preparing for. So that's what the update I can give you in terms of the vaccine development and the vaccine situation here in China.
Maraming salamat, Ambassador Chito. So, lilinawin ko lang po, kasi po dito sa Pilipinas, paulit-ulit sinasabi ni Presidente, the Chinese have the vaccine. So, parang totoo po, no? They already have the vaccine na binibigay na nila sa kanilang mga frontliners. Tama po ito, no? Tama
yes,
po ito,
yes.
No? Yes.
As a matter of fact, beyond the frontliners, there have been reports in Chinese media that certain areas in China, some local governments are already distributing it or deploying it for certain citizens, no? So merong nangyayari dyan in a city in near Shanghai, in East China, na nag-uumpisa na yan. And certainly the company executives and employees of the different pharmaceutical companies involved in the vaccine development, they have volunteered to be part of the different phases of the trial, at halos lahat yan na-vaccinate na rin.
Ang second clarification ko po, sinasabi rin talaga ni Presidente na may kasunduan sila ni President Xi na meron po tayong prioridad. Meron po talaga tayong prioridad sa distribution ng vaccine na galing po sa China.
Yes, that is true. This was reiterated during the recent visit of Secretary Locsin, and if you look at the DFA statement, this was mentioned. We are among the priority countries. Of course, ASEAN in general is included here, but the Philippines in particular. Of course, this means that we have to get ready for the distribution and deployment of the vaccine, and that is why these Chinese pharmaceutical companies that are going to manufacture these vaccines are already have been telling us that what is required really is the cold chain storage facilities around the country, or certain strategic areas around the country, kasi when the vaccine had to be handled very well.
Thailand's premier revoked an emergency decree that had been intended to quell pro-democracy rallies. The former military chief had indicated late Wednesday he was preparing to lift the state of severe emergency as part of a move to diffuse tensions. The premier said in a televised address Wednesday that the country must step back from the edge of the slippery slope that can easily slide to chaos.
ผมต้องปกป้องประเทศจากพลังมืดที่ไม่ว่าจะมาจากที่ใดก็ตามไม่ให้สร้างความเสียหายให้กับประเทศไทยของเราผมต้องทำให้แน่ใจว่าประเทศไทยยังคงมีความยุติธรรมในสังคมเราได้เห็นการกระทำที่น่าหดหู่ใจอย่างมากที่เกิดขึ้นกับเจ้าที่ตำรวจมีการทุบตีทำร้ายตำรวจด้วยครีมเหล็กขนาดใหญ่และมีพฤติกรรมรุนแรงไม่เหมาะสมอีกหลายอย่างต่อเจ้าหน้าที่นะครับซึ่งเป็นการตั้งใจทำร้ายคนไทยด้วยกันแต่เวลาเดียวกันเราก็เห็นว่ายังมีคนอีกมากมายที่แม้ว่าจะกำลังทำผิดกฎหมายแต่ก็ปฏิบัติตนด้วยความสงบมีเจตนาที่ดีที่ต้องการขอความยุติธรรมให้เกิดขึ้นในสังคมและมีความจริงใจที่อยากจะเห็นประเทศดีขึ้นผมกำลังเตรียมที่จะยกเลิกพรก.สถานการณ์ฉุกเฉินที่มีความร้ายแรงในเขตท้องที่กรุงเทพเร็วๆนี้ยกเว้นหากมีสถานการณ์รุนแรงใดๆเกิดขึ้น
Over the past 3 months, demonstrations have taken place across Thailand, led by young people who have challenged the country's establishment. including the powerful monarchy and institution long shielded from public criticism. Last week, the authorities tried to halt protests by introducing an emergency decree in the capital that bans gatherings of more than 4 people and the publication of news or online information that could create fear or affect national security. Dozens of people, including protest leaders, have been arrested. The measures, however, sparked even larger rallies and prompted protesters to employ cat-and-mouse tactics to outmaneuver the police.
In other news, ASEAN education ministers shared their experience in integrating technology in education and pledged to improve the resilience of ASEAN education systems at the Conference of the Digital Transformation of Education Systems throughout ASEAN. The online conference took place in Hanoi, Vietnam on October 15 and was attended by over 100 participants representing youth, academia, the private sector, and international organizations. Education ministers also reiterated the need to develop both digital and transferable skills among students, while education systems across ASEAN are increasingly digitalized in recent years. This shift has become more urgent given the disruptions posed by the coronavirus. YTech founder and executive director Audrey Pei participated as a youth representative in the conference. YTech, a nonprofit based in the Philippines, harnesses technology to break gender barriers in education and skills development. She presented the key findings of UNICEF's survey between August and September this year that collected perspectives from over 8,000 ASEAN children and youth regarding technology and education. Results show that high costs, poor infrastructure, and limited information are the main challenges that ASEAN children and youth face when acquiring digital skills and literacy. Representatives from the private sector and academia also weighed in on issues surrounding the digital transformation of ASEAN's education systems. SAP Southeast Asia's President and Managing Director Verena Xiao highlighted the importance of engaging the private sector in the delivery of education and skills. On his note, Harvard Graduate School of Education professor Fernando Reymere underscored the need to reimagine education in the face of COVID-19 and in the context of urgent global issues such as climate change and inequality. The ministers concluded the conference by agreeing in principle to a joint statement that expresses their collective commitment to promote access to digital technologies as well as digital literacy and transferable skills. They're also committed to ensure inclusion and equity in education, harness public-private sector partnerships, and highlight the role of children and young people in the digital transformation of education systems. The Ministry of Education and Training of Vietnam hosted a conference with the support of the ASEAN Secretariat and UNICEF.
International donors on Thursday stumped up an additional $597 million in humanitarian aid for Rohingya refugees languishing in camps in Bangladesh after they fled ethnic violence in Myanmar. The UN had appealed for more than $1 billion this year to meet the humanitarian needs of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, where more than 800,000 are sheltering in sprawling camps, having fled across the border. But it had only managed to raise $636 million in humanitarian assistance so far. At a virtual conference co-hosted by the United Nations Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, Britain, the United States, and the European Union donors pledged $597 million more in aid. The UNHCR said 860,000 Rohingya refugees were living in camps across Bangladesh, southeastern Cox's Bazar districts. Some 740,000 fled across the border during a 2017 military offensive in Myanmar, for which its government faces genocide charges at the UN Staff Court. Other countries in the region host some 150,000 Rohingya refugees, while an estimated 600,000 live in Myanmar's Rakhine state.
In a related news, the Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. affirmed the Philippines' long-standing humanitarian tradition during the virtual donor conference on sustaining support for Rohingya refugee response on October 22. Again, let's listen in.
Following his sweeping victory in 2016, President Rodrigo Duterte declared to the world, "We will accept them. We will accept them all. They are human beings." He was referring to the Rohingyas, people who live almost 2,000 miles away from the Philippines, across barriers of geography, culture, language, and politics. But these considerations were irrelevant to my president. For him, they are human beings, and that's all that matters. Since then, year after year, he has repeated these words with consistent conviction and clarity. Not a clarion call, never an outburst. He speaks with resounding earnestness. The hand-wringing world of talk-gooders won't admit it, but it knows this is not lip service. This is an open door. A month ago, at the UN General Assembly, President Duterte reiterated, "The doors of the Philippines are open as they have always been, to everyone fleeing for safety, such as the Rohingyas."
Likewise, the Secretary conveyed his gratitude to the U.S. and the EU, the United Kingdom, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for organizing the event where he announced the Philippines' assistance for refugees from the Rakhine State. The Philippines has a long history of hosting refugees from other Asian countries and as far as Europe. During World War II, then Philippine President Manuel L. Quezon ordered the admission of 1,500 Jewish refugees fleeing from the Holocaust. Following the war and the communist victory in the Civil War in China, thousands of Chinese refugees also settled in the Philippines.
The Duterte administration has three options to regulate rice importation without violating existing rules of the World Trade Organization and the rice tariffication law, the head of the Senate's Economic Affairs Committee said. Senator Amy Marcos made the assurance at the Senate joint hearing of the Agriculture, Agrarian Reform, and Ways and Means Committees convened to tackle Senate Resolution 536 seeking to improve rice importation procedures. For instance, Marcos cited their request for a 90-day prohibition on imports before harvest to protect local farmers from a glut and could trigger a plunge in prices. She said this could be presented as a specific seasonal ban that we need to develop and support depressed rural communities whose main income derives from rice. When it is this specific, the WTO cannot have an issue with that. That's not non-tariff barrier, she explained. Marcos also cited an issue raised by Committee Chairwoman Cynthia A. Villar on phytosanitary invocation by other countries as a move to restrict Philippine exports. Marcos added, and I quote, "Our neighbors are so good at this. That's why there's what people call diplomatic terrorism or trade terrorism. That was done with banana or pineapple. Why can't we do it with rice imports? Anyway, we know some rice exported here had effects. We've seen how some shipments looked," unquote. Moreover, Marcos brought up the issue on technical barriers to trade, or TBT, that involve methods like product testing and certification procedures applied to assess that an exported product meets foreign regulations.
tayong lahat. Saya-saya.
Hello there. Imagine Dami got the virus, and she infected 2 more. And those 2 infected a lot more of people. And it goes on and on until it became an epidemic. But what if Dami stayed at home? Then those 2 wouldn't have contracted the virus. Then those people would have not been infected. This is not just your battle, it's everyone's, and you can be a huge help. Follow social distancing, or better yet, stay at home.
Malalayong lugar ang kanilang narating para maghanap buhay. Tulungan ang pamilyang iniwan sa sariling bayan. Yan ang ating mga overseas Filipino worker. Pero dahil sa di pangkaraniwang pangyayaring hatid ay krisis, may ilan sa kanilang nagpasyang umuwi. Pinagyaman ang sariling lupain, nagtayo ng negosyo na kasama sa puhunan ang sipag at tiyaga. Ang mga OFW, maraming sakripisyo, ninanais maging kapaki-pakinabang maging sa kanilang pagbabalik bansa. Sapagkat ang ating mga bagong bayani, Pilipino pa rin sa puso at damdamin.
Welcome back. Joining us live from our EBC Sri Lanka Bureau is Vanessa Viloria Silva. Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Alma. Good afternoon.
Long time no see.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Vanessa. What do you have
Yes,
for us?
Alma. Health authorities temporarily closed the island nation's main fish market yesterday, Thursday, October 22, after 49 traders tested positive. Another 259 patients have tested positive. 182 are from Peliagoda Fish Market, 2 are from quarantine centers, and the remaining 75 are close contacts. The government imposed the curfew in parts of the capital and some areas outside Colombo. Police quarantine curfew had been imposed in Gampaha District, Cotahena, Mataculia, Modara, Blumendal, Grand Pass, and Welampitia police areas, with immediate effect till 5 in the morning on Monday, October 26. Police spokesman DIG Rohana says that vehicles will be allowed to pass through Gampaha District during the quarantine curfew. However, vehicles are not allowed to stop. Schools and key public offices have been closed. Public gatherings are banned, and restrictions imposed on public transport. And for COVID-19 update, Alma, in Sri Lanka, 6,287 total confirmed cases, 3,561 recovered and discharged from hospitals, leaving 2,712 active cases, and Sri Lanka witnessed 14 deaths. Back to you, Alma.
All right. Thank you very much for your updates there in Sri Lanka. You keep safe. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you very much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Alma. Reporting live from Sri Lanka, this is Vanessa Viloria Silva, and we live in interesting times.
In other news, global financial titan Goldman Sachs agreed to pay $2.9 billion in penalties to settle criminal charges in the 1MDB Malaysian bribery scandal. It's the largest U.S. fine ever in a corruption case, according to the Justice Department. Now, acting U.S. Assistant Attorney General Brian Rabbit said Goldman accepted responsibility in the case that involved $1.6 billion in bribes, the largest ever recorded, and massive gains laundered through the U.S. financial system. Goldman Sachs helped raise $6.5 billion for the Malaysian government sovereign wealth fund. The U.S. Justice Department has said more than $4.5 billion was stolen from 1MDB by high-level officials at the fund and their associates between 2009 and 2015. The investment fund was looted by corrupt officials and their co-conspirators, including senior Goldman bankers, turning it into a piggy bank for corrupt public officials and their cronies, according to Rabbit at a press briefing. The guilty plea could curtail activities of Goldman Sachs Malaysia, but allows the parent company to avoid admitting wrongdoing in court, which would have damaged its ability to do business.
Micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs, in the Philippines receive the least volume of bank loans compared to their counterparts in peer nations. A recent study from Asian Development Bank, or ADB, showed. ADB's recent study entitled Asia Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Monitor 2020 shows that Philippine banks only lent $11.6 billion to MSMEs in 2019. This is the smallest MSME bank loan total in 2019 among the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN 5 comprises Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore. Data also shows that the Philippine MSME bank lending has been consistently lagging among its peers since available data starting 2011. This is despite the passage of the Republic Act 9501 in 2008, mandating banks to allocate 10% of their total loan portfolio in MSMEs. The law expired in 2018. MSMEs has been playing a critical role in driving the national economy, accounting for 99.5% of total enterprises and 63.2% of total employed labor force. Data showed that the percentage of the Philippine MSME non-performing bank loans to the total MSME loan portfolio of banks was the highest in the region.
Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga said Japan opposes escalating tensions in the South China Sea. This was during a press conference held during his trip to Indonesia and Vietnam, his first visit overseas since taking office last month. Take a look.
日本は南シナ海の緊張を高めるいかなる行為にも反対をします。南シナ海をめぐる問題のすべての当事者が力や威圧によるのではなく、国際法に基づき紛争の平和的解決に向けて努力することの重要性を改めて強調をいたします。
The Prime Minister also said that Japan will provide 50 billion yen or $473 million to Indonesia in its fight against the coronavirus. According to NHK, they reaffirmed to step up cooperation in the field of security, including the transfer of defense equipment from Japan. They also agreed to promote economic cooperation, such as strengthening supply chains to cope with the pandemic. Prime Minister Suga said both Japan and Indonesia are maritime nations in the Indo-Pacific region and that he wants to further strengthen their traditional friendship. The meeting at the presidential palace in Bogor, south of Jakarta, comes as Prime Minister Suga, on his first foreign trip since taking office on September 16, seeks to strengthen ties with Southeast Asian countries to counter China's growing influence. Indonesia's exclusive economic zone overlaps with China's 9-dash line, which marks the world's second-largest economy's expansive claims in the South China Sea, while Vietnam is one of the claimants in territorial disputes in the area.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Wednesday he would raise concerns about China next week as he travels to India, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Indonesia. Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mark Esper will be visiting New Delhi early next week for a dialogue with their colleagues from India, whose relationship with China has sharply deteriorated this year over a deadly border clash. Pompeo said he would afterward visit Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Indonesia.
Advancing here at the State Department, we're cooperating with our partners and allies and friends across the world in unprecedented ways. It's been a hallmark of the administration that, frankly, deserves more attention. Look, it starts with working to go out and meet with these people. This Sunday I'll depart for India, for Sri Lanka, for the Maldives, and then on to Indonesia. On every stop, I will discuss a broad range of bilateral topics, but also work to find out with each of those countries the best ways that we can make sure that we cooperate to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific. I'm especially looking forward to doing that with Secretary Esper in our 2+2 ministerial dialogue with our Indian friends. It's been postponed because of the virus. I'm glad we're going to be able to execute that in person here in just a few days. I'm sure that my meetings will also include discussions on how free nations can work together to thwart threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. And on that front, good news, this Friday the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell and I will launch the U.S.-EU dialogue on China. I'm confident that the discussion will deepen our long-term engagement with EU friends on this important issue. For instance, Europeans are concerned too about the environment, just as we are. Just this week, the CCP issued a fact sheet that was, fact sheets in quotes, a fact sheet trying to divert attention away from its own horrific environmental record. Let me give you a few real data points. The PRC is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, bar none, number one. The PRC is indeed responsible for an estimated 30% of plastic pollution on the world's oceans, more than any other country. The PRC is the world's largest consumer of illegal wildlife and timber products. Again, number one. The PRC flagged our own vessels constantly fish illegally or overfish in waters under the jurisdiction of other coastal states, in particular in Africa, Asia, and in South America. We're pushing back on the Chinese Communist propaganda efforts here at home, too. Today, I'm announcing the State Department is designating the U.S. operations of 6 China-based media companies as foreign missions. They are all substantially owned or effectively controlled by a foreign government. We're not placing any restrictions on what these outlets can publish in the United States. We simply want to ensure that American people, consumers of information, can differentiate between news written by a free press and propaganda distributed by the Chinese Communist Party itself.
In other news, representatives from ASEAN sectoral bodies on disaster management, health, and social welfare development convened in a high-level roundtable on October 14 to discuss accelerated actions in addressing the pandemic. The roundtable took place during the official launch of the ASEAN Guidelines on Disaster-Responsive Social Protection to Increase Resilience, a collaborative effort among the 3 sectors with support from the UN, the European Union, the ASEAN Development Bank, and the Canadian government. Over 200 participants from ASEAN sectors, policymakers, CSOs, NGOs, INGOs, academies, and think tanks, as well as national and international partners or organizations attended the roundtable. Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community, Kang Fo Wak, officiated the launching ceremony. In his opening speech, he noted that the development and implementation of the guidelines will accelerate coherent actions across sectors. Hernando Caraig, the Assistant Secretary of Civil Defense Office of the Philippines, said the country undertakes the chair of the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, said the guidelines will allow more adaptive and inclusive social protection systems to anticipate and meet the needs of vulnerable groups and mitigate the impact of potential crisis. For his part, Deputy Head of the EU Mission to ASEAN, Lucas Gajdo, praised ASEAN member nations for their significant progress in building crucial social protection mechanisms to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. He also stated that the document is a vivid example of how ASEAN sectors have been coordinating effectively and efficiently to reinforce each other's comparative advantage to reach those who are most vulnerable. Protecting the most vulnerable groups requires social protection to go beyond poverty reduction objectives, and the guidelines will help reach this goal, he stressed.
ASEAN and the United Nations have reaffirmed their resolve to uphold multilateral cooperation and build a rules-based international order. This is one of the major points stressed at the online ASEAN-UN ministerial meeting on October 21 under the chair of Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Pan Bin-mi. The annual event also drew the attendance of ASEAN foreign ministers, the president of the 75th session of the UN General Assembly, and the UN Secretary General, and the Secretary General of ASEAN. The meeting aimed to review progress of the ASEAN-UN Comprehensive Partnership and preparations for the 11th ASEAN-UN Summit slated for the next month. Both UNGA President Volkan Bozkir and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres emphasized that ASEAN represents an indispensable partner and voiced support from the bloc's centrality and community-building efforts. The UN also spoke highly of Vietnam's role in rallying efforts to respond to the COVID-19 and step up ASEAN community building in its capacity as the current ASEAN chair.
Esther and I will be back with ASEAN in Focus. Please stay tuned.
Hindi mo ba alam, mauubos daw ang mga tissue products? Bakit naman? Ang raw materials daw ng mask at tissue products ay iisa lang. Saan naman galing ang balitang yan? Ay basta, narinig ko lang din. Maraming diling kayang nagpo-post sa Facebook at Twitter, kaya kung ako sa'yo, kumuha ka na din. Sige na't mauna na ako sa'yo
Huwag basta-basta magpaniwala
sa mga nakikita
o nababasa sa social media.
Magsaliksik at i-verify ang lahat ng impormasyon
na kukuha sa internet.
Tandaan,
maging responsable tayo
sa paggamit ng social media
nang hindi magdulot ng panic sa iba.
Kung paanong dapat labanan ng COVID-19
ay gayon din ang ating pagsugpo
sa black propaganda
at maling impormasyon.
Dennis Lu,
Lou Omelda,
General Partosa,
Tyranel Pililu,
Hannibal Arevalo,
EBC
Japan Bureau. We live in interesting times.
Welcome back. Dubbed the CIA, Thai street food have been a regular fixture at the recent outbreak of the anti-government protests, with vendors often rushing to protest sites even faster than the protesters. Take a look.
บางวันก็ได้มั่งไม่ได้มั่งพี่แล้วทีนี้มันมีม็อบคนมันเยอะผมก็คิดว่าถ้าไปขายม็อบเนี่ยมันจะได้เยอะกว่าเดิมไหมสรุปคือผมลองมาคือแล้วมันโอเคครับผมก็เลยมาพวกผมจะไม่มากันมั่วๆนะคือจะวางแผนกันก่อนว่าวันนี้เขาจะมีม็อบไหมถ้ามันเกินเวลาที่เรากำหนดว่ามันไม่มีเราก็จะไม่ไปหรือถ้าว่ามันไกลจากที่พักเราก็จะไม่มาครับผม คือเราจะติดตามทางเพจทางทุกช่องทางทั้งคอมเมนต์ทั้งทุกอย่างครับผม
From monitoring vital signs to filtering filthy air and even translating speech into other languages, the coronavirus-fueled boom in mask wearing has spawned an unusual range of high-tech face coverings. As masks become the norm worldwide, tech companies and researchers are rolling out weird and wonderful models to both guard against infection and cash in on a growing trend.
ずっとこのコロナが起きてから人はですね、ウイルスの攻撃にずっとさらされてきたっていう、何もなすすべがないみたいな、ずっと、それをですねテクノロジーでもしかしたら少しでもソーシャルディスタンス保ちながら、収束に近づける、テクノロジーで何かウイルスに対抗するみたいな、そういう人間の知恵で対抗できるんじゃないかって。
This thing can be used as maybe a simple indicator of the early signs or danger signs of maybe an infection coming. And we will be able to warn the people to quickly go and see a doctor to get a swab done or to get their proper checks done.
Esther, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing? Looking pretty as always.
Thank you, Alma. It has always been my pleasure, and I'm fine as always.
And Pattaya, how is Pattaya now? How are things there? Can you give me a picture on how it's looking there?
Okay, right now the beaches are open, but the tourists are still lesser than the normal. And yes, they are hoping to open up the tourism here in Pattaya as soon as possible.
What about restaurants? Are they open now? Or
yes,
okay.
The restaurants are open now, and everything seems going back to normal, Alma.
It's just that the tourists are not so much right now.
Yes, the tourists from other countries. But the local tourists are still coming into Pattaya.
Okay, so it's more of domestic tourism for now. For now. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you're okay, doing fine, doing good. Esther, thank you so much for joining me today and for helping me out.
Thank you so much, Alma. I'm Esther Odanga from EBC Thailand Bureau, giving you the news in the dynamic ASEAN region.
Thank you, Esther, and I'm Alma Angeles. Esther and I will live in interesting times.
is still containment.
We are in uncharted territory.
Thailand volume 450. FIO to 100%.